Ever get the feeling that, like, you can tell what someone's really thinking just by how they talk? Like, you can almost read between the lines.
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to do a deep dive into a fascinating article that I think proves that it's more than just a feeling.
Okay.
It's a whole field of science, actually, psycholinguistics.
Yes.
So the article is called "The Trump-Harris Debate Shows How Personality Can Reveal Itself in Language."
Okay.
And it was published on September 16th, 2024, in case you want to look it up.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, we're going to be focusing on this past presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
Interesting.
And we're going to uncover some hidden meanings behind the candidates' words, which I think is super interesting. But we're also going to learn how to apply these insights to our own lives. So before we jump into all that, can you give us a little background on psycholinguistics itself?
Sure.
Like, what are the core principles at play here?
Okay, so psycholinguistics, it basically looks at the connection between language and the mind.
Okay.
Like how our thoughts and feelings can actually influence the words that we choose.
Right.
And then how those choices shape how other people see us, how we interact with people.
And how we see ourselves.
Yes, exactly. And one of the key ideas here is that, we don't just use language to communicate.
Yeah.
It's really a window into like our inner world. Right?
Really? Yeah.
So the words that we choose, whether we mean to or not, they can reveal like hidden thoughts, our motivations, even biases that like we may not even realize we have.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's like you can tell if someone's lying.
Just by listening to the words they're using.
It can be like that, yeah.
Wow. That's wild. This reminds me of something that happened to me just the other day, actually. I was in a meeting, and this colleague of mine, he was describing a new project.
Okay.
And he kept saying things like, well, try this, or hopefully it'll work out. And, on the surface, he seemed optimistic, but something about his language kind of made me uneasy,
Really?
Like I had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. And it wasn't until like way later when the project actually hit some roadblocks that I realized like, oh, you know what? My gut feeling was right. The way he was talking, the words he was choosing, it actually betrayed a lack of confidence that even he probably didn't realize he was projecting.
Yeah.
Which is kind of wild, right? It is really interesting. And it's a perfect example of how real this psycholinguistic stuff is.
Yeah, for sure.
Like we can pick up on these subtle cues in how people talk.
Yeah.
That can tell us about their underlying emotions, their intentions, even when they're not saying those things directly.
Yeah, totally. Like sometimes you just get a sense that something's off.
Right. Right. And it's often these little linguistic giveaways that tip us off.
Exactly. Yeah. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention to the whole Trump-Harris debate, because this article really dug into some fascinating examples of how both candidates use language strategically.
Okay.
One of the first things that stood out to me was how Trump addressed, or rather didn't address, Harris directly. Like he never actually said her name.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, so the analysis, it found that throughout the whole debate, Trump never actually referred to Harris by her name. Like they used pronouns, like she and her.
Right.
But he never actually said Kamala or Harris. And this is actually something that's called distancing.
Distancing.
Yeah, and it's a way to kind of like subtly diminish your opponent.
Yeah.
Without actually attacking them.
Right. Like you're trying to make them seem less important or less real or something.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to pretend they're not even there.
It is.
Yeah.
It's like he's trying to make her disappear.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because by not even acknowledging someone by name, it's almost like you're taking away their power in that conversation.
It is. That's such a good point. Okay, so that's one tactic. What else did you notice about the way Trump was using language?
Well, another thing that really jumped out at me was how often he used what we call uncertainty words.
Uncertainty words.
Yeah, so like phrases like, could be, maybe, perhaps.
That's interesting. I would have thought he'd be all about like super strong, certain language, like no room for doubt or whatever.
Yeah. Seems kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But actually, it's a pretty common thing in politics.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And especially for people like Trump who, try to come across as like, super confident and all-knowing.
Right.
It's almost like a way of seeming confident, but also leaving yourself some wiggle room.
That makes sense.
So they're not making like totally definitive statements
Yep.
that could come back to bite them later.
Right.
You know, it's a way to kind of have their cake and eat it too, linguistically speaking.
I love that, linguistically speaking.
Got to use the right words, you know?
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about some of Trump's tactics, but what about Kamala Harris?
Yeah.
What can we learn from her word choices in the debate? So it's like he's projecting this air of confidence, but underneath it all, there's this like ambiguity.
Exactly.
You think that's intentional?
I think it could be. You know, like it's a way of hedging his bets, you know?
Right.
Like he can always say, well, I didn't actually say that for sure.
I said maybe?
Yeah.
That's so interesting how that works. Okay, so we've been talking about Trump, but what about Kamala Harris?
Right.
What jumped out at you about her word choices?
Well, it was interesting because, like, in contrast to Trump, who kept saying I, like, all the time,
Right.
Harris used we a lot and us.
Interesting.
Like, her whole approach was more about, you know, shared responsibility, collective action.
Okay.
Like, remember she said something like, we must do better, or this is about us, the American people.
So it's kind of a classic me versus we kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Trump's coming from this individualistic perspective, and she's emphasizing more of a, like, collaborative, team-oriented approach.
Exactly. Yeah, and you know, it makes you think, like, different voters are probably drawn to those different styles, right?
Totally.
Some people, they want a leader who's, like, really strong and decisive and, you know, they don't mind the eyes. But other people, they're looking for somebody who's more collaborative.
Right. Someone who's going to bring people together.
Exactly. And psycholinguistics can actually, like, help us understand how those tiny little word choices can actually, like, tap into those, you know, really deep psychological preferences that people have.
Wow. It really makes you realize how much goes on beneath the surface when we communicate, right?
It does.
Like, even just choosing a pronoun can reveal so much about, like, how someone sees themselves, how they want to be seen.
Totally. And it's not just the pronouns either, right?
Right. It's the whole, like, overall tone and style, too.
Exactly.
Like, did the article talk about that at all?
Yeah, they did. They looked at the kind of, like, emotional tone of the language, and they found that, you know, Harris's language was generally more optimistic, hopeful.
Makes sense.
And then Trump's, on the other hand, it often, like, evoked more fear and anger.
Right, which, again, totally tracks with, like, their whole, you know, platforms and how they communicate in general.
Totally. And you know, it's important to remember here that these little word choices, they can have a really big impact on listeners, even if we don't always realize it.
Right.
Like, when we hear language that's really emotionally charged, it triggers all this stuff in our brains and our bodies. And it can actually even affect our decisions without us even realizing it.
See, that's kind of what I find a little bit creepy about all this. Like, even when we think we're being totally rational, our brains are still being manipulated by all these subtle cues.
I know. It is kind of creepy, but it can be empowering too, you know.
How so?
Because once you understand these techniques, you can start to see through them.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So instead of just being manipulated, you can actually be in control.
Yeah, totally.
Right. It's like you're not just being, like, played by the words anymore. You're actually, like, calling the shots.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so, wow. This has been incredibly eye-opening.
Yeah.
I feel like we've been given this, like, secret decoder ring for understanding, like, all these hidden messages in, like, just normal, everyday language.
Totally. And it's a really valuable skill.
Yeah.
Like, you know, to be able to do that in your own life.
Yeah, totally.
Like, imagine if you're trying to get a raise at work, or you're, like, in an argument with somebody.
Right. Or even just, like, having a normal conversation.
Even just, like a regular conversation, exactly. If you're more tuned in to this stuff, it can really, like, give you an advantage.
Oh, totally. Like, you'll be able to tell when someone's, like, not being sincere or whatever.
Yeah, or like, think about a job interview.
Okay.
Right? If you're, like, really strategic with your language, if you use a lot of we statements, if you, like, kind of subtly mirror the way the interviewer is talking, and you choose words that, like, show how competent you are and how excited you are, you can really, like, use that to your advantage.
Totally. It's almost like you're speaking their language, but you also have this, like, deeper understanding of what's actually being said.
Exactly. Yeah, like, it's like you're speaking their language, but you're also speaking, like, this whole other language.
Yes, exactly. Wow. And like you were saying before, this all applies to our personal relationships too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like sometimes my partner will say something and I can just tell by the way they're talking that they're actually like stressed out about something else.
Exactly.
Even if they're not like directly talking about it.
Right, like they might not even realize it.
Yeah. And so then I can be more like understanding and supportive, you know?
Exactly, yeah, and that's huge.
For sure. Well, this has been so fascinating.
Yeah.
Honestly, I feel like I have a whole new toolkit now for like navigating just like communication and relationships in general.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's like learning a whole new language, right?
Totally. And, you know, it makes you realize that there's always more to learn.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Psycholinguistics is like a constantly evolving field, you know.
Right. Like the more we learn about language in the brain,
Yeah.
the more we learn about like what it means to be human.
Totally, totally.
Wow. Well, that is a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into the world of psycholinguistics. Thank you so much for, for teaching us about all of this.
Oh, of course. It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, we encourage you to start paying more attention to the language that you use and the language that other people use around you. You might be surprised at what you discover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.